I'm really honored, and I have to underline that. I have to chair this last panel and the last talk with we have a very distinguished professor here. And everybody, I think, most of you know her, but I have to introduce her for a while. And I'm sure that it's a short introduction, but you know more. We have Suraiya Faroqhi, a professor of history at the Hamburg University. She graduated from Hamburg University, Istanbul University, and Indiana UniversityBloomington, and is one of the leading experts in the field of Ottoman history, as I say. Faroqhi has published many books in English, German, and Turkish. Recent publications are, just to mention a few of them, A Cultural History of Ottomans, The Imperial Elite and Its Artifacts, London, Tauris 2016, and Artisans of Empire, Crafts and Craftspeople under the Ottomans, London 2009. She also holds an honorary doctorate from Bogazici University in Istanbul, if I pronounce right. Yeah. So today, Professor Faroqhi, she is going to talk, is going to give a speech on victory celebration in the early modern Ottoman Empire with sidelong glances at Venice and attempt at comparison. Please, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me? Is it working properly?
No.
No, it's not. Okay. Is it okay now?
Yes.
Great. Well, first of all, I know that most of you do not work on the Ottoman period, so thanks for coming anyway. At the same time, I mean, this is a conference on spaces, and I hope to say something about space that was used and organized in order to celebrate victories. And as we will see, some of these victories were real, and some of them were maybe imagined, and some of them may have been real but were of relatively little importance. Because, I mean, and that's, I think, important to remember, that political discourse and legitimizing discourse is almost by definition a mixture of a few true statements and a lot of imagination. And, you know, imagination is a polite word. If we were not in a public lecture hall, I would say something else, but you all know what I mean. Okay, now, why, first of all, you will say, why do we want to compare Istanbul and Venice? Because, I mean, well, when I listened to the previous talk, the Ottoman buildings of Tirana were constantly being talked about as being, quote-unquote, Oriental. Well, you could say that Venice also, in some ways, I mean, there is Deborah Howard, who has worked on Venice, and who has pointed out the affinities to Middle Eastern cities, especially Mamluk Damascus and Mamluk Cairo. So, you know, you might say, well, if you use the word Oriental, which I don't use, but if you were to use it, you could use it in a sense that's broad enough to include both the Ottoman Empire and Venice. On the other hand, it's also true that at the time when these two polities existed, the relevant elites would not have emphasized what they had in common. They would have emphasized, for the most part, what separated them. And I mean, there, conquest played an important role, because in the medieval Mediterranean, Venice was a major power, had, fortified ports on islands and on the Greek mainland, and also, it held Crete, had held Crete ever since 1204, and in the 16th century, for about 2 generations, held Cyprus. So, therefore, and as you know, most of these places were gradually conquered by the Ottomans, beginning in the middle of the 15th century, first under Mehmed the Conqueror, later under Bayezid II. Well, Cyprus was conquered under Selim II in the 1570s, and Crete, the last one, in the middle of the 17th century. Well, I mean, so at the end, what was Venice left with? Well, I mean, a couple of ports in what's today Croatia, on the coast, with very small hinterlands, so much so that the subjects of Venice in the 18th century sometimes went to work in Istanbul, like as gardeners. On the other hand, I mean, the one major fortress that Venice was able to hold on to was Corfu, or Kerkyra. But, I mean, that was all that was left of the Stato da Mar. So, yes, when we speak of Venice's being sidelined in the 17th century, usually we think in terms of the Atlantic economies, and that's true, of course, nobody would deny that, but in addition, the fact that the Ottomans had conquered these places one by one also had a role to play. On the other hand, in spite of all these wars, there was a lot of trade. And Venice was the one port in Christian Europe where Muslim merchants in sizable numbers went for purposes of trade. And I mean, the Venetian archives have plenty of documents, and there are quite a few people, beginning with Maria Pia Pedani Fabris, who have studied this material. So there was a strong presence of Ottoman merchants. And yes, some of them were Orthodox, some of them were Jews, but there was also a sizable Muslim presence, which is something you don't get anyplace else. And in the early 17th century, when Venice's power in the Mediterranean was definitely on the wane, still there were enough people for the Signoria to find it worthwhile to transform a previously existing palazzo into the Fondaco dei Turchi. And the Fondaco dei Turchi remained in function as long as the Republic of Venice was there, even though in the 18th century there weren't many tenants anymore. But in the 17th century, until the battle over Crete, there had been enough people there to make it worthwhile to, invest in the transformation and upkeep of this building. Later they didn't. It's perfectly clear from early photographs that by the mid-19th century, this building was in a state of advanced decay. So therefore, I mean, even though the two polities were very often at war, and even though most of the time the Ottomans were victorious, not 100% of the time, but a lot of the time, there were also I think, other features that make a comparison interesting. First of all, the invocation of heavenly support. And both sides were into this. I mean, if you go to the Palace of the Doge, you will see Venice being lifted to the skies. And if you are interested at all in religious painting, you will see that it is a barely secularized version of an assumption of the Virgin Mary. So it's perfectly clear that, well, you might say, in Venice, the Virgin Mary became like a minor divinity in the Christian pantheon. I say this consciously, knowing that doctrinally speaking, it isn't so. But in the veneration of people, it may have looked that way. Okay, so I mean, both sides were convinced that the deity was on their side, and they had comparable ways of making that visible in space. Well, and one of them was buildings. And now let's see whether this works. See if I do this. Okay. This is a photograph of the Arsenale Gate. I've got some more, you'll see them in a minute. Unfortunately, I apologize, it was a slightly misty day, and I only had one day, so the mistiness is not due to my camera, it's due to the weather that day. I mean, it didn't fully clear up throughout the day, and I took this between, I think, 11 and 12, and as you can see in the morning, there had been even more mist. Okay, so, I mean, this is the Arsenale Gate, and, I mean, those of you who have had a chance to look at the article that I recommended will see that it is a composite of different parts. The lower part is an imitation of a Roman triumphal arch. Well, I mean, in Venice, they didn't build such things normally, because I think they were considered imperial and therefore unsuitable for a republic. I mean, you know that kings and princes had triumphal arches built in the Renaissance and the Baroque period all over Europe. But in Venice, they otherwise didn't do that. But in Pula, which was at that time, it's Pula in Croatia, I think, they had a Roman arch that had been built into the medieval wall, and they imitated this when they built the wall for the Arsenale. And they then put a kind of calque of this triumphal arch into the wall as a gate. Well, the attic is of a later period. And as you can see, I mean, it's the Lion of St. Mark. And that was added in the 16th century. And even later, in the 17th or around 1600, I mean, or in the very late 16th century, they added the figure of Santa Giustina. And well, what's this about? It's a reference to the Battle of Lepanto. And that's why I said victories that may not have been very significant, because the Venetians lost Cyprus in spite of Lepanto. And after all, yes, the Ottoman fleet was very seriously damaged, but they were able to rebuild the ships within a year or two. The one major loss that they may have had real trouble kind of making up for was the loss of experienced seamen, because they don't grow on trees. I mean, you can't replace them from one year to the next. But otherwise, this didn't really, amount to anything much. But it was a propaganda affair. And some of you may have seen the work of Stefan Hans, who has written a recent and very brilliant book on the way Lepanto was celebrated and made use of all over, mainly Catholic Europe, but not exclusively Catholic Europe, because it also was celebrated in certain Protestant communities. Okay, fine. So there we have, you might say, the archetypal victory monument for a victory that was not all that significant. Well, we find other such cases in Venice in the 17th century. Those of you who have seen Santa Maria del Giglio, St. Mary of the Lilies, will have noticed that the facade has almost no religious imagery, but has a variety of Venetian possessions where the donor served with no very great distinction. He was ultimately deposed for military incompetence, and then he was sent as an ambassador to Rome, which is why you will see a picture of Rome on the facade. The point is that, again, you know, you have a religious monument that was made in order to commemorate in this case, almost non-existent victory. Okay, what about the Ottoman side? If you have seen the article by Güldur Nicipoğlu that was also in my bibliography, you will see that she has studied, as this was at the beginning of her career, and she's by now probably the art historian of the classical Ottoman period, but at that time she was a beginning scholar, and she studied the inscriptions of the Süleymaniye, of the great mosque put up by Süleyman in the middle of the 16th century. And it turns out that the inscriptions make many references to the victory of the Sultan, and now, funnily enough, not over the unbelievers, but over the heretics. And the heretics are the Safavids in Iran. So that is a point on which the inscriptions insist, and therefore you can see that the Süleymaniye was not just a victory monument, but among other functions, it had this one as well. Well, and then in the early 17th century, we have another, again, a public monument ordained for victories yet ungained. I mean, that is from a Handel oratorio. And in this case, it's a real ungained victory, because Ahmed I was notorious for not having gained any victories. In fact, he died at age 27. He scarcely had the time, really. And yet, when he built the great Sultan Ahmed complex, a person who was close to the builder produced a poem, a qasida, which is all about Ahmed I as victor over the heretics, which was exactly what he had not done, because in his reign, the Ottomans were forced to conclude a rather disadvantageous peace with Shah Abbas I of Iran. And in fact, Ahmed was roundly criticized in his own time, not so much for putting up a monument to non-existent victories, but rather because it was assumed that you shouldn't build such a complex out of people's taxes. It should come out of booty obtained in war against the infidels or maybe even the heretics, but there was no such thing. And therefore, we don't have the writings that criticized him for it, but his imam felt it necessary to write a little text justifying the Sultan Ahmed Mosque, saying it was the Sultan's generosity, and generosity was a virtue no matter what the circumstances. But apparently, the grumblings and rumblings didn't disappear because Evliya Çelebi, who was born in 1611, so, you know, when the mosque was completed in 1617, he was a child in primary school, you'd say. And Evliya tells us in his account of Istanbul that yes, sultans should build their buildings, you know, with the booty obtained in holy war, and meaning by implication that Ahmed I did something inappropriate. So you can see that, again, I mean, the Sultan Ahmed Mosque was not meant to be in itself a victory monument, but the sheer fact that somebody close to the builder celebrated it in this fashion means that at least this was in the back of people's minds. You can see that you might want to put a victory on the map, you might say, and therefore put up a building, and in the Ottoman case, commemorate it through inscriptions and poetry, and in the Venetian case, by very obvious references like Santa Giustina. And then, you know, you make sure that it is visible in space. Well, then, of course, there are the victory parades. And one of them, I can show you in an Ottoman miniature. There it is. Now, this is a late 16th century miniature which shows Mehmed III, who reigned until 1603. He wasn't there for very long. He came to the throne in 1595 and was only on the throne for 8 years. But he accompanied the army in one of the Hungarian campaigns, and there was just one major field battle in this whole campaign, the Battle of Hajaba, which the Ottomans won. So Mehmed III organized what you might call triumphal entry into Istanbul, and that is depicted on this miniature. Just a minute, if you permit me. I'm sure you've all seen these bands. Well, they are costly silk textiles. And I mean, if you get closer, even on this image, it's clear that that's what they are. And, you know, some of you have probably seen pictures of Venice and other Italian cities on festive occasions, where people also hung out tapestries of various kinds, usually out of the windows, to celebrate the occasion. Well, the Ottomans didn't do that, but they did bring out costly textiles that were held up by these guardsmen, and apparently, at least on some occasions later, these were distributed among the soldiery. Well, so we have Mehmet III. And the idea was to show him as the central figure by making him somewhat larger than the other figures. Only the problem is then that he's too large for the horse. Well, I mean, that was a problem the artist didn't manage to solve. And I mean, also, of course, again, we've been talking about imagined and semi-imagined victories. Well, in this case, the victory was real, but Ahmed III didn't have much of a role in it, because, fortunately, you might say, the campaign was commanded by a vizier who was able to reverse a potentially disastrous decision of the Sultan in good time and thereby ensure victory. If Mehmet III had been the commander, probably this would have ended in an Ottoman defeat. And then, of course, I mean, in 1606, the Habsburgs and the Ottomans ended the 13-year-long war. And you can't really say that, the Ottomans made very important gains. They got a few fortresses which were not terribly important in themselves. They would have been important if they had ever been able to conquer Vienna, but as we know, that didn't happen. So you can say, well, for 13 years of war, these 2 or 3 fortresses are maybe not that important again, but that didn't prevent Mehmet III from having a victory parade organized. Now, I mean, this is the one case where we have a picture, an Ottoman picture. However, victory parades happened of which we have only written descriptions. One of them comes from a petty French nobleman by the name of Jean Palerme, and Palerme was in Istanbul in the early 1580s and has given us a lengthy description of the victory parade involving the battles of Cyprus. And I mean, when you read the descriptions, they look very much like similar shows that were put on by the Habsburgs. I mean, in both cases, you get fortresses that are stormed, and then, of course, it's always the organizing side that is victorious. And I mean, we have that in Ottoman Istanbul as well. Apparently, in all of this, we also have to think in terms of rivalry among grandees, because in the case of this 1582 procession, the Kapıdan Pasha, the commander of the fleet, had an even more spectacular show put on, which apparently involved flooding part of the At Meydanı, of the festive site, and apparently the Sultan Murad III decided that he liked this better. So this martial show put on concerning the conquest of Venetian fortresses, well, I mean, it was part of a game of rivalry between Lala Mustafa Pasha, the conqueror of Cyprus on the one hand, and Uluç Ali, the commander of the fleet, on the other. Well, I mean, in Venice, to outsiders, of course, the Ottoman elite always showed, a united front. And we are all kul of the Padishah, and we all serve him with devotion. But as I said, I mean, this parade made it quite clear that, intrigues are part of any court. I don't think there's any court where you don't have court intrigues. And I mean, the Sultan's court was no exception to the rule. And, well, in Venice, too, there was a great emphasis on the unity and concord among high Venetian officials. And I mean, I'm sure many of you have seen these people in their official robes presenting their respects to the Madonna with the Christ child. I mean, the Friary Church is full of them, and so is the Palace of the Doge. So usually, you know, it's group portraits in their official robes, which are the same for people of the same rank, and they all give this impression of unity. But as I told you, I mean, in real life, it was of course different. And the story of this person who decorated Santa Maria del Giglio, well, I mean, he was really ignominiously chased out of military command, but he was rich, and therefore he was able to afford the decoration, even though, I mean, he had been sent to Rome in disgrace, you know, because I guess they hoped that he wouldn't be able to cause any further disasters. And then, I mean, so we have another important factor are illuminations. Now, illuminations for us are something pleasing at night. You know, yesterday evening, for instance, coming back, well, I mean, it was nice to have certain illuminated buildings, especially in the rain, which kind of guided you and told you which way to go. But you have to imagine that early modern towns were pitch dark at night. I mean, really pitch dark. And in fact, I mean, people weren't supposed to be in Ottoman towns, they weren't supposed to be out on the street after the night prayer. At the same time, Ottoman sultanic festivals, and that included dynastic festivals like the births of princes and princesses, but also victories, were celebrated with illuminations. That's called donanma. And the governor would receive the order from Istanbul to order the inhabitants of the town to illuminate their houses for something like one night, or 3 nights, or whatever. And of course, this was quite an expensive business because, I mean, I'm sure poor people just put a few candles in the windows, but even candles were not that easy to come by. So I presume that quite a few people sighed like furnaces when there was, you know, again, another sultanic festival to be celebrated with a donanma. However, I mean, elite figures took this very seriously. And once again, we have a very nice description of such a festivity in a provincial town in Aleppo, where apparently this donanma was celebrated with a great deal of fanfare, to the point that you could take a walk in the street. And I mean, that seems to have been something that the Ottomans liked in order to commemorate festive events, including victories, because, I mean, this Venetian author who was present in Aleppo in the 17th century, later 17th century, he describes that the donanma, you know, the city was so well lighted that people went on walks in the town in the middle of the night. Well, we have a similar description by a French visitor who was in Istanbul at the time of such a celebration, and who describes how the covered market, which normally closed at nightfall, and it still closes at 7 o'clock in the evening, but these people kept it open during the night, and again people went for walks looking at the stands under artificial lighting. And in addition, they would hang chains of lights which could then be made to form an inscription, especially on the Sultanic mosques, because Sultanic mosques had 2 minarets, the others did not. I mean, therefore, when you see 2 minarets, mosques with 2 minarets in outlying parts of town, you can be sure that they are 20th or 21st century structures, because in Ottoman times, nobody who was not a sultan or the mother of a sultan could have had a mosque with 2 minarets. So, yeah, you grin because of the 4 minarets that are being built. Well, yes, I mean, in Ankara there's a similar such mosque, and people in Ankara make jokes about it. Well, so, the Sultanic mosques would then have these bands of light that formed inscriptions. And well, you can see something like that during Ramadan, even in today's Istanbul, but today it's nothing special because the city is lighted to a certain extent anyhow. But this was not true in the 17th century, when otherwise the place would have been pitch dark. Well, and then, I mean, we should take a look at Venice, where, of course, parades were also. How much time have I left? 15 minutes. Okay, that's great, because I've been hurrying, thinking that I was not going to have enough time. So, therefore, we might look a little more closely at Venice. In Venice, first of all, yes, something like Lepanto was celebrated with a great deal of fanfare. And I mean, there are several images, both in the Ducal Palace and in the Art Museum, that show that, the major painters of the age were asked to commemorate this event in their paintings. So, I mean, there is a famous one by Veronese which shows the ships in battle, and on top of it a heavenly scene. And usually you will find together a representative of the emperor and a representative of the Pope and a representative of the Doge or the Doge in person. Well, all of this is again, not to be taken with a grain of salt, because Venice and the Pope did not see eye to eye, both on political and religious issues. Political, because in the late 16th century, it was clear that the ruling family of Ferrara would soon die out, and Ferrara was the feudal lord of the rulers of Ferrara was the Pope, but Ferrara is immediately adjacent to Venice, and Venice also wanted this. So, I mean, in real life, relations were not terribly good. Secondly, I mean, yes, in Italy, Protestantism never really took root, but in Venice, there was a coterie of intellectual types that were interested in Protestantism, and especially Lorenzo Lotto, who I'm sure some of you know as an important painter. Well, he wrote a diary of the pictures he had painted, and that included in his youth a picture of Martin Luther and his spouse, Katharina von Bora. And apparently some people in Venice who felt at least some sympathy and who felt that maybe priests should be allowed to marry and they would lead more respectable lives. And so, you know, then a way of symbolizing that was to have small pictures of Luther and Katharina von Bora together. I mean, the people that the Venetian Inquisitions did hand over to the Roman Inquisition were not really Protestants, but people who were like kind of on the margins of Christianity. And yes, that happened, and one of them was then executed in Rome on the Campo dei Fiori. But on the whole, the Venetian Inquisition was extremely reluctant because they needed the permission of the Senate to hand anybody over to the Roman Inquisition. And for the reasons I just described, the Venetian Senate was very reluctant to do so. So there was a certain amount of what you might call intellectual sympathy for Protestantism in Venice throughout the second half of the 16th century. So therefore, the concord of the Doge and the Pope in front of the Virgin Mary or in front of Santa Giustina, depending on the picture, well, that was also something of an illusion, just like I described that these two Ottoman commanders were vying for the approval of the Sultan. In the same way, I mean, these Lepanto pictures suggested a unity of purpose, which was not there, because the Venetians made a separate peace in 1573, deciding that their trade in the Eastern Mediterranean was so important that it was worth giving up Cyprus for the resumption of this trade. So again, therefore, there was no unity of purpose, even though the pictures suggest otherwise. Well, and then of course, you get the problem, in the 17th century especially, what victories are there? Because, I mean, there was a long war over Crete, and the Venetians wound up losing it. And then in the 1680s, they joined the so-called Holy League, and yes, managed to briefly take back the Peloponnesus, but apparently misgovernment was so bad that when the Ottomans came back in 1715, the locals were happy to have them back and be rid of the Venetians. So, you know, you can't really define the war in the Peloponnesus as a success anyhow. And what's more, they managed to, in the course of all this, they managed to destroy the Acropolis. That it was a German officer serving under the Venetians who ordered the bombing of the Acropolis, and the Ottomans had gunpowder stored there, and that was what blew up the Parthenon. So, well, I mean, that wasn't so great either. So we find that the Venetians celebrate victories in the 17th and even 18th centuries that are far in the past. And I mean, for instance, there was a naval victory of the late 1300s, which was like, you know, 300 years out of date by that time. But that didn't prevent the Venetians from having victory parades, thanksgiving for victories. And then, of course, I mean, Lepanto, of course, and Santa Justina's Day. And they might even celebrate victories that were completely temporary. In the 1360s, there was an uprising against the Venetians in Crete, which they managed to suppress, and that was still being celebrated in the 17th century. Well, and I mean, therefore, something interesting happens. The Doge, by that time, it really spends most of his working week attending ceremonies and taking part in processions, because he's expected to do that in person, and attending masses of thanksgiving in commemoration of all these assorted medieval victories, which means that the Doge at that time is no longer a political figure of major proportions. That is being done by the various councils, and the Doge is a representative figure, sort of like a constitutional monarch. Well, in Istanbul we get a similar development, but it's somewhat different, namely that from the time of the later years of Süleyman, he begins withdrawing from public occasions. Well, in part it's probably due to simply old age. A lot of elderly people tend to do that. But then it continues under his successors. I mean, Murat III goes so far as to relocate his primary residence in the harem, which means that even the Grand Vizier cannot see him unless the Sultan comes out, which explains why we still have collections of notes written by the Grand Vizier to the Sultan for his perusal. Yeah, I have 5 minutes. Well, that's fine. In any event, the result of it all is the same. Namely, that the Ottoman Sultan, especially in the 17th century, there are some interruptions, but he also tends to become a ceremonial figure. And in both cases, it is a variety of formal and informal councils. In the Ottoman case, viziers, palace officials. If the Sultan is very young, then the Queen Mother as well, that that have a large contribution in the running of the empire. And as we have seen, the same thing is true of the Doge. And the Ottoman Sultan appears in public much more rarely. But when he goes every week, he is supposed to go formally to Friday prayers in one of the city mosques, and that is the occasion of a parade, even though it's a relatively short one. So you can see that similar developments, like the formalized, the fact that the supposed head of state becomes a ceremonial figure, this is again something that the Ottomans and the Venetians share, even though, the Venetians have more parades than the Ottomans do. At the same time, we also see that the parades and victory celebrations are meant to paper over the disputes and the confrontations between members of the elite. Now, among the Ottomans, these confrontations are a lot more dangerous because the loser is very likely to get executed. It happens a lot. In Venice, that normally doesn't happen. Normally, such people at the very most may get banished. But, as you can see, I think, out of all of this, the two polities have much more in common than you might think if you listen to their ideological speeches. Then it looks like they are on opposite sides of the spectrum, but when you look more closely, you find that in many respects they are really quite close. And when on the other end of the spectrum you think maybe of the France of Louis XIV, or the Netherlands, or England or Great Britain under James I, well, then the Ottomans and Venice are fairly close together on this spectrum. And I think I'll close on that note, and thanks for your attention.